Hi, my name is Eric Herman. I'm with Concordia Seminary, and today we're going to do another book review for a new book published by RJ Grunwald called Luther with Romans. RJ, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Reading Romans with Luther. Now, I remember studying Luther's Romans commentary, and it was about this
Yeah,
fat.
it's a little bit bigger.
So this is a little bit of a different presentation of Luther's Romans lectures.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Okay, well, before we get there, tell me a little bit about yourself. You're a pastor, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm a pastor at Faith Lutheran in Troy, Michigan, which is just outside the Detroit area. And so I've actually grown up in that congregation. So I started going there probably about second grade. Both my wife and I started going there. We weren't married then, but we started going there as children, grew up in the congregation, got involved in student ministry, and just over the years, I did youth ministry a little bit at a church not far from there, and then came back to do student ministry there, and then just almost 4 years ago started the SMP program because the church I grew up wanted me to be a pastor there. So I'm serving as a pastor there, do a lot of work within our student ministry, and then just preaching general pastoral ministry at the congregation. On top of that, my wife Jessica, and then we have 2 kids, and then number 3 is due in March.
So you're a busy man, and this is not your first book that you've published, is it?
It's my first with a publisher. I've done some self-publishing on my own. Not too long ago, I self-published The Art of Law and Gospel, which is meant to be kind of a short read, maybe like an hour and a half introduction for people kind of new to the whole law-gospel dynamic.
So I'm starting to see a theme here, and that's trying to introduce Lutheran theology and important Lutheran writings to an audience that isn't familiar with the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've always, growing up Lutheran, for a long time I didn't really realize that there was much unique about Lutheranism, because that was all I ever knew. And then as I started to understand that not everybody read the Bible like I do, all the insights from Luther's thought just began to pop out. And then I began to see, all right, people need to hear this, because they're not understanding the beauty and the richness that comes from our heritage. And so I've just kind of made it my goal to take I don't really want to say anything new, but take all these old things that all these dead guys said and just try to say it in new, fresh ways that people can hold on to.
So then explain how that led you to do a version of Luther's Romans lectures.
So a little over a year ago, I took a public domain work of Luther's commentary on Galatians, and just the sole intention was to give it away for free, throw some graphics in it, and shorten it a little bit. And so while that was happening, I began talking with Concordia Publishing House, and they liked the concept there, and so they asked me if I'd be interested in doing anything else. And so they gave me then this list of Luther's works and said, do you want to do any of these? And I said, why not Romans? That's an important book when we talk about justification, the gospel.
Right.
So I said, we'll do that, put together a proposal for them, and then I'd used Luther's commentary on Romans casually. Like as a pastor, I'd be preaching in Romans, and I'd say, what did Luther say about in chapter 2, verse 1.
Right.
But then I started to do this, and I just began to think, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into?
Well, explain this. Why did you have that reaction when you first read Luther on Romans?
As I started to read it, with a commentary like Galatians, there's a bit of a narrative to it. It's relatively easy to read. Even if you're not into theology, you could still do some work and read through Luther's commentary on Galatians. But with Romans, these are just lecture notes that were never intended to be a book. And so what you can really tell that this doesn't have the narrative as much to it, and it doesn't have he didn't have an editor. It was not meant to be read in a book. Right. And so that made it incredibly challenging, and it also jumps around a lot more because he's not developing a thought for the sake of a sermon. He's just working through the text with his students.
How did you negotiate that with which clearly was a lecture, and it was a very important lecture, which we'll talk about in a minute, but about the format, how did you negotiate that with this text?
Yeah, what I ended up doing is, as I read through it, I just kind of started working through the text and just highlighting portions that I really liked. The lectures on Romans are broken into 2 parts, and you'll have to help me on the pronunciation, the scholia and the glosses.
The glosses and the scholia.
And so the latter half of the book, it has a little bit more of a narrative to it. And so as I read that, there was a lot more to hold on to there. And so I found myself, most of the sections that I was finding that could work in a more devotional format were coming from there. And so what I began to do is I just highlighted. And then after I did that, I took all that together, and then I began to freak out because I didn't know how, there was no good progression to make it a book. And so I just threw it all over my office floor and looked at it and tried to figure out, all right, what are we going to do here? Because I agreed to do the book, but I don't know how it's going to be a book. Right. And so I began to look for common themes. And so if he talked about righteousness, unrighteousness, I wrote that down in the corner, found another one where he did that. As he talked about suffering, I began to piece those together, and as he developed law, gospel. And so began to find these themes that weren't necessarily it wasn't all one theme in chapter 1 or all one theme in chapter 2. And so I then began to see, all right, well, if I take these thematically, then we might have something that you can actually read. And so I took all those chunks, which eventually became the chapters, and then I just figured out, all right, how can I guide people and weave people through those different chunks of his thought?
Right. And yeah, it does appear kind of like a thematic collage of Luther's ideas. Now, the way you guided people through is really interesting. I'll give a little bit of my understanding of the background of Luther, and then I'll get you to react to kind of what you did. I mentioned that Luther's Romans lectures were really important. They weren't published, so they weren't important in the sense that everybody read them at the time, but they're important for his students. After he finished these lectures, some of the students shared these notes in a public setting in the university, and when the rest of the faculty heard what had been going on in Luther's classroom, it kind of exploded, and it just changed the entire faculty, and then it kind of grew from there. But just trying to imagine what it would have been like to be a student who has this whole view of the way life should be and salvation and what makes you a good person, and then have Luther say the things that he said in such a way that it completely changed the way I would think about those things. Of course, back then, a student would be thinking about medieval theology, about medieval church practices and pilgrimages. That's I suppose, not the audience that you're looking at, and not necessarily guiding people into that context. So how do you give context to Luther's themes?
Well, what's interesting is, despite the fact that we don't live in a world with the same medieval structures, with the same kind of works righteousness, the Christian church is still kind of has the same issues. Right. There's still this mentality that it's about what I do for Christ more than what Christ does for me. And so what I saw, and that's part of why I love Luther so much, is everything he was saying was just as much needed today as it was then. And so what I saw in Romans is what he was teaching to his students was an antidote to the do more, try harder Christianity in today's world. And so in an evangelical culture, what we've found is it's not really been about the good news. It's been about the good Christian life, which matters, and even Luther in Romans will unpack how to live the Christian life. But when that's the focus of the Christian message, you've taken the focus off of Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And so Luther was discovering that, and the book of Romans is what changed that for him, that he began to see the gospel and the freedom in it. And so my hope is that this can do the same. For there's been a lot of people who have just been beaten up by the church. They've gone to the church and they needed somewhere to go to, and when they were looking for something to set them free, they just got beat up. And so my hope is that there are people who are looking and longing for that, and that Luther will begin to be able to give that to them, and that I can just point them in the right direction towards how Luther did that. And then for those who have grown up in a church like I have, who have heard the same kind of Lutheran theology, the same kind of reformational theology, that you never hear it too much. And so it's just a reminder, we can just, the same thing in new ways. And so we can keep hearing that so that we can behold the beauty of the gospel. I
mean, when I first heard that you had done this, and I was your teacher at one point too, but I was skeptical for a moment until I got a chance to look at it, because I read all this stuff as a historian. And so I know that this was written in 1515 and 1516, and I know that Luther's theological thought develops and he gets clarity, and he's still got old ideas. So some people would think that Luther's Romans lectures aren't Lutheran. In other words, Luther's not Lutheran yet. How did you again sort of navigate that issue? I mean, I think you recognize that as well, that there's ways of speaking that he would clarify later.
Right.
But how did you relate Lutheranism to how Luther speaks?
Well, that's actually one of the things that surprised me as well, is actually how much of there that I understood to be significant about the Reformation that actually came this early.
Right.
And so as I was doing it, because the Reformation, we recognize it as beginning October 31st, 1517.
Right.
But it's not like that's when suddenly he had all these insights. This had been growing. And so what you see as he's teaching the book of Romans is you see these things developing. And so what I tried to do as I worked through Romans is to kind of pick out the ways that I saw that reformational theology already growing and resonating with him in those moments, and then bring in the fullness of reformational theology as I've grown to learn it, and also bring that into how I'm navigating people through those. And so as Luther's talking about law gospel, it's still early, but it's there. He's making clear distinctions in the two words of God and God's demands and God's promises. And so you see that already developing in the midst of this medieval system.
Right.
And so then by just knowing now that how it develops and continues, I was able to read Romans now with Galatians in mind.
When I read through it then, in a sense it was a refreshing read to actually, I mean, I kind of know historically where Luther's at in Romans and what he's trying to do, but the way you couched it and presented it, you actually see how striking and evangelical, in the traditional sense of the word, Luther is so early on. I mean, how incredible. To read Lutheran theology back into early Luther is fabulous. We were talking earlier before we started this interview, about some of your favorite passages. What are some of the more powerful things that you saw in Luther's writings? Like you said, you didn't expect all of them, but what are some of the things that kind of last for you that have legs?
Yeah, one of the ones that really just jumped out for me and that I kept coming back to over and over again, Luther in there said, the church is the inn and the infirmary for the sick. And there's something about that just resonated with me. When I think about my calling as a pastor, my calling as a husband and as a dad, and the mission of the church, like all of it just all gets wrapped up in that mission that's all centered on the work of Jesus Christ. And so that just resonated with me, and Luther's heart for that message being, I mean, that's why, as Lutherans, it's the article on which the church stands or falls.
Right, right.
Because that's what we're about as a church. We don't just exist to be an insular group, but those who are sick, which is all of us, those inside and outside. Luther also in Romans calls the gospel the remedy. And just that language of the sickness, the remedy, the church as the hospital for sinners, is just this beautiful language that he used.
Jesus is the great physician, but the church is the place where we welcome the sick, we welcome the sinner, and it gives a mission to the church.
Yeah, well, that's what I love. There's this simultaneous grounding in justification, yet this missional pull of the church. And there's this beautiful thing about that. He's sending the church on mission almost with that statement. And he's not talking about mission, go outreach kind of thing there. But you can't separate justification from mission. Like if you understand that the gospel's for the sick, you're going to find sick people to bring the gospel to. Like you can't separate those. Right. But what I love about it is it's not these tactics. It's just the gospel. Find any way to bring the gospel to people. Mm-hmm. And so bring the remedy to the people who need it. And so that's exactly what Luther did in his day. He found a way to bring the gospel and bring it into the language of the people, using the technology of the day, so that people could receive the remedy.
Well, I think you're working well within the legacy of what Luther was trying to do. We really appreciate you doing this, first of all, and I think this is a wonderful text for any kind of devotional reading, and I hope that people outside the Lutheran tradition get a hold of this and are able to both read your guidance and your kind of the insights that you bring to the table, as well as read these profound words of Luther. So RJ, thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, excellent. And Reading with Romans, get it at your bookstore, amazon.com, cph.org. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, I'm Eric Herman.